There's this idea that the mechanization of nature, that is the paradigm of, let's say, early modern physics of the 1600s and 1700s. We have sort of bought into that, and we have basically, it's like most people believe that we're just machines.
Yeah, biochemical determinism. And this is something that we'll get onto later, I'm sure, about the foundations of an objective ethic from the non-theological perspective, because when you start arguing from a position of biology or evolution, you can get into determinism. And
one of the problems, I'll just readily admit, which you may think that I wouldn't do, but I will admit it, that I think one of the main problems with the modern world is that we are sort of try to be simultaneously very tolerant, extremely tolerant of basically everything on the one hand, which makes us be a bit averse to moral language. And we sort of think that anyone who would dare to say that we are not just mechanical beings who have zero moral obligations would be treated with derision.
Yeah, the idea of it's don't judge me is constant.
Yeah. And honestly, one of the weirdest things I hear is the idea that don't judge because if you judge, other people will judge you.
Yeah, I'm happy to be judged. Thank you very much, because I hold myself to my own standards.
Not only that, other people will judge you.
Yeah, they're just lying about it if they say they don't.
Yes. Okay, now, moral nihilism, I would say, is the opposite of moral dogmatism that affirms the truth of particular, let's say, moral propositions, positive propositions. It's the rejection of moral values and the rejection of everything that is moral. So
disbelief in belief.
Yeah, you could say, or disbelief in the normative. Moral nihilism would say that now all talk about value is a fiction. It is just a way that, you have the Thrasymachine view that, no, that's not the Thrasymachine. You have the conventional view that says that very frequently all morality is made out of a conventional code, and that conventional code is basically not moral or immoral. It's amoral, and it is just used by people who want to consolidate their power in society. And they propagate morality as a sort of myth, or as a sort of, let's say,
slave morality to control people.
Yeah, to control people. The other bit is moral skepticism. Now, skepticism isn't nihilism. Frequently people conflate them, but skepticism is, technically speaking, the suspension of judgment. So the skeptic would not even say, I don't know. They would not judge. That is the most sophisticated form of skepticism. So very frequently people say skepticism is self-defeating, because when you say that I know that I do not know anything, you know something, therefore it's wrong. That's not exactly what the skeptic would say, or how the skeptic would act. That's a relatively unsophisticated form of skepticism that's very easy to refute, but it's not the, let's say, the Pyrrhonist skepticism that involves a suspension of judgment, and you constantly ask why. You abstain from affirming the particular proposition. So it seems to me that in our world, we have desperate need for moral reflection and moral, let's say, thinking. And that needs to be a bit more widespread, because we are in a culture, we live in cultures that seem to praise amorality and seem to most people seem to implicitly believe that morality is basically a myth. It's just something that we say because in our previous unenlightened forms, we couldn't understand how mechanical we are. And now that we understood it, and science gives us a mirror to look ourselves, and it shows us the truth, it's basically outmoded to talk about morality, and it is just a language that people use in order to control other people without believing it.
So to tie a lot of these threads together, I think moral skepticism is not a place you can stay. It seems to me more an epistemological tool for testing the validity of various moral systems. And the problem we've had is with too much excess skepticism, of too much dogmatism prior to the scientific revolutions and the Enlightenment, we've eroded a lot of the good things that came with some of the dogmatic institutional faiths, because there were obvious bad things like the corruption of the church and things like tithes and paying your way into heaven and things like that. So what we've got now is we've ended up in a morally nihilistic place where people have made a utilitarian calculus out of the fact that there is no objective morality in their mind. And so that springboards into, right, well, I can't live without values because that's paralyzing. I have to create my own values. And that often comes down to the, I am a meat machine, so I'll follow my hedonistic impulses and satiate my hormones and drives.
Because I choose so.
Yeah, and that's because that's the basest level of motivation. And so that becomes a utilitarian idea of maximizing the fastest and most convenient route to the most amount of pleasure. And that's good because it's a good outcome, not necessarily because I'm being virtuous. Or people that are languishing in nihilism become subjects to other people's moral dogmatism, because without a tradition to fall back on, as we said from the start, or without their own imbued moral convictions that they can have as an instinct or that they truly believe in, they latch onto someone else's for a sense of meaning because their consciences are just screaming at them. And so that's the difficult place we're in. I think skepticism has been wielded more as a sledgehammer than a tuning fork. And so we need to understand skepticism properly and then have an appropriate amount of moral dogmatism to be affirmative in saying, no, this is good and this is bad. And this is the individual route to the good if you want to be a virtuous person. Yeah.
And one thing that is a bit interesting to point out is that skepticism is traditionally associated with conservatism, because skeptics, by suspending judgment, they just went on autopilot. And when you go on autopilot, you basically adopt the customs of the country you're in.
Return to tradition.
But that is the issue, that the question is, what sort of tradition do we go back to now? And what sort of, we have very complex societies, and it's very difficult to pinpoint aspects of those societies and say that's tradition or the other's tradition. And the question is, has mechanistic thinking become part of Western tradition? Because if it has become a part of Western tradition, then skepticism breeds amorality. And that form of conservatism breeds amorality. So the question is, have we embraced mechanism to a place, to a degree that we cannot return from? Or should we, let's say, because this is how, that is the issue. That's how moral skeptics act now. They frequently, let's say, okay, I'm going to suspend judgment, but in suspending judgment, we see that the force of culture leads them into, frequently, I'm not, of course there may be exceptions, but I would say that the force of habit, you would say, leads them into recreating features of our current society. And not every feature of our current society is a good one. So I don't know whether a healthy antidote here would be a sort of moral dogmatism where we say, listen, okay, I don't know what you're doing with all this mechanistic thing. I reject it. I don't agree with it. I don't have to embrace it. It's not enlightenment or obvious. And, just I'm going to do my thing.
So that's the reactionary position. So to ground this in a historical example, I was talking to Mary Harrington about this in my interview. She's done a great book. And her argument is that the main thing driving moral revolutions, particularly the way in which skepticism is wielded, is technological advancement. And so the Industrial Revolution, centralizing people in cities, conscripting women into the workforce in relatively similar levels to men, leveling male and female biology, meant the inevitable rise of feminism. And so now what's happened is, and this is why the Curtis Yarvin conception of Cthulhu always swims left, that this is why the conservatives are going to be saying, no, the left are the real racists, and eventually 10 years down the line, the left are the real transphobes, is because the way that which technology progresses us makes it so that it is harder to have parochial, local, and national cultures as we are broadening the boundaries of human interaction to cities, countries, and global homogenization. And so what that means is that to have and dogmatic does not necessarily mean wrong, but to have a defended and objective morality encoded in a particular tradition would require us to reject a lot of the material presuppositions that have been baked into contemporary thinking.
Exactly.
And so this is Mary's example of, well, the conservatives saying we need to go back to 1950s for the trad wives isn't traditional enough, because that is the point of boomer truth that set us into the current day that atomized the family. We don't need to go back to 1950, we need to go back to 1450. And so that's the strain of thinking that the reactionaries are on that you've just outlined there.
Question here, because that's a really good point. Because one of the issues with talking about tradition, we are talking about ways of life.
Yes.
And the more complex a society gets, the more complex it becomes, the more difficult it is to pinpoint that aspect where you say, that's the way of life that I'm talking about, that's the other, because it's very mixed. There are good and bad things about a complex society that cannot be said all to be one way of life. There are many ways of life. So the thing is, whether, and I'm really interested with the fact that you mentioned cities. Would you say that, and Josh has done great contemplations about cities, whether cities are the problems, do give that a watch. The question is the form of life within cities trying to sort of emulate? Of course, that's not the reason behind it. I would say that mostly money is the reason behind it, but it's an interesting thing to observe. Does it try to be impartial with respect to people, as opposed to parochial? And could there be a sort of analogy between what we said about before, about the impartial perspective of morality, the perspective of morality that aims to absolute universality, necessity, and impartiality on the one hand, and on the other, a more, let's say, a view of morality that is a bit more welcoming to partiality, where it says, for instance, of course you have extra obligations towards your children and your family. Of course, you should be proud of, let's say, your country. And that's the patriotism that McIntyre is talking about, and we talked about with Bo on Symposium 7.
I think you can have that, and the evidence of Victorian London is a great example of that, because even though there were material pressures that made it horrible for people in the workhouses, chimney sweeps, and likewise, there was moral and material progress going on there in a very English way, because they're famous for their propriety and stiff upper lip and their costumes and all that. I think the economic pressures, the amorality and the focus on GDP line go up has demolished the ability to defend the parochiality of a city, just with overwhelming numbers of parallel and adversarial moral traditions being packaged in there just so you can register people on a graph. And so what you would need is a limited and steady stream of people who join the city from either the countryside or other countries that have a pre-vested interest in incorporating into the moral tradition rather than living at odds with it just to benefit from the material benefits. And this is part of the mechanistic thinking. We need to extricate material benefits as one of the primary considerations of social organization and focus primarily on culture. And this is the argument that Carl's been kicking up with Elon Musk recently, saying that no, even mass immigration for hardworking people is not enough, because you're still considering the money rather than people being bearers of civilization. And that's what makes for a moral and orderly society.
To watch the full video, please become a premium member at lotuseaters.com.